With the likely withdrawal of the United States and its European partners, and I say likely because I haven't made a final decision on this, I'm just putting it at about 80%, Europe is left in a complicated situation. But even so, the Europeans are determined to take on the responsibility of keeping Ukraine militarily functional and to become a strategic military player on the global stage, with some leaders even considering sending troops to Russian territory to defend the rest of the country. And others are warning about a possible future Russian attack against their European territory. But putting speculation aside, what can we actually say about the war capabilities of Russia and Europe? And I say war because war is much more than just military strength, and that's what we're going to look at in today's video. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know, because your support is very important. It might not seem like it, but when you share this video with other people, it encourages the YouTube algorithm to boost the channel more and more. So it's a very important support. And don't forget to follow us on our other networks, Telegram and Instagram, to stay up to date with the channel's news and world geopolitics. I'm Delian Pera and you're watching the World Geopolitics channel. There are two things you need to keep in mind. The first is that war is not soccer or any other sport. It's not the one with the best athletes who wins, but the one who has the best backstage support and the most well-defined and achievable objectives. The second is that the military element, that is, the soldiers, the officers, and even the generals, in modern war are just the tip of the iceberg, often not even being the main players in the conflict. Let's begin with an analysis of Russian capabilities. The original plan for the Russian invasion of Ukraine called for a rapid destabilization of the Ukrainian government by Russian special services, followed by a military offensive to take the country's political and economic centers in about 10 days, with consolidation over the course of a few months. That's why, initially, Russia did not expect to spend large amounts of ammunition or lose much military equipment. That's why there was no prior industrial mobilization before their operation. However, the failure of this initial plan led, as early as March 2022, different Russian ministries to suggest an immediate mobilization of both personnel and the military industry. The Kremlin initially postponed the mobilization of personnel, believing that Ukraine's limited stockpiles of weapons would be insufficient to sustain prolonged resistance. However, the surprising and increasing supply of Western weapons to the Ukrainians and the stagnation of Russian offensives in Donbass led Moscow to revise its expectations and prepare for a war of attrition, then betting on the inability of Ukraine and its Western allies to sustain the military effort in the long term. Officially, the Russian industrial mobilization began in July 2022, with changes in legislation allowing the Russian government to mobilize all available industrial capacity, including deactivated facilities and strategic reserves of essential materials for war production. Labor restrictions were imposed, forcing workers in the military-industrial sector to work up to 12-hour days, reducing rest to only 1 day off per week, and canceling vacations. In addition, companies were prohibited from refusing to provide goods and services to the state, and direct purchases without bidding were allowed. In 2022, the Russian defense industry had about 1,400 companies, with 977 of them linked to the Ministry of Industry and Trade, 166 to the Ministry of Defense, 80 to Roscosmos, and 43 to Rosatom. In total, the government directly or indirectly controlled more than 4,000 companies, involving more than 4.5 million direct or indirect workers, which was equivalent to approximately 10% of the Russian population when including family members. Rostec, one of the largest state-owned defense corporations, alone accounted for 40% of Russian military orders in 2022. Even with a significant reduction in exports, Rostec increased its revenue in 2023 to almost 3 trillion rubles, which is approximately $34 billion, a growth of about 33% compared to the previous year. About 80% of the military equipment used in Ukraine has contributions from this company. Companies like Roscosmos and Rosatom have also greatly increased their production for defense. Roscosmos quickly made up for commercial losses in the West, estimated at $2 billion a year with new military orders. Between 2024 and 2026, about 1 trillion rubles will be used, which is approximately $12 billion, and this is planned for the development of missiles and military technologies at the expense of military programs such as lunar exploration. Rosatom, traditionally associated with civilian nuclear energy, has greatly increased its involvement in conventional and nuclear weapons production. In 2023, more than half of its $16 billion revenue came from unsanctioned international business, allowing the company to have continuous access to sensitive technologies and components from the West. Rosatom has also expanded the production of critical microelectronics for advanced weaponry, which includes vital drones and missiles. In addition, to meet the growing demand for labor, defense industries began employing students in their final year of college and technical training, as well as still using convicted criminals. In May 2024, approximately 34,000 prisoners were already working forcibly in the war industry, a number that is expected to rise to 80,000 in 2025, with government plans to further expand this practice. Because of this, the military logistics system also adapted, creating advanced military workshops that allow 66% of damaged equipment to be repaired directly by military units and another 22% by specialized mobile teams, with only 7% being sent for more complex industrial repairs. In this way, Russia has demonstrated an enormous effective capacity to mobilize industrial, financial, and human resources very quickly, allowing for a successful transition to a prolonged war economy and contradicting initial predictions that overestimated how quickly its military resources would be depleted. Some even said that Russian ammunition wouldn't last for 3 months, and others claimed, in an absurdly dishonest way, that the Russians were already fighting with sticks. However, just as war is not fought only by soldiers, it is also not fought only by industries. Because we also have to analyze the ability to withstand economic friction, and the Russian financial mobilization to sustain its military industry and the war efforts in Ukraine. It's something much bigger and more complex than the simplified analysis of the official budget of the Russian Ministry of Defense itself. In 2024, although the official Russian defense budget was about $52 billion. Its size is similar to the United Kingdom or France. In reality, considering spending on security, intelligence, and additional investments in other sectors, the total amount reached approximately $150 billion, representing about 38.6% of the Russian federal budget and approximately 6.7% of the country's gross domestic product. A very important part of this increase was directly aimed at the war in Ukraine. For example, in 2022 alone, the value of the state defense order was about $27 billion, increasing in 2023 by 1.5 times and continuing to rise in 2024, and everything indicates that it will remain in 2025 increasing. To cover such expenses, Russia massively resorted to bank loans, mainly through Pronsvias Bank, designated by the Russian government as the main financier of the military-industrial sector since 2019. These loans have subsidized rates between 5% and 6%, which are much lower than the Russian central bank's basic interest rate of 16% and the normal commercial interest rates, which are between 18 and 19%. In addition, substantial defense spending has been financed by other civil budgets through state programs, such as the development of space activities, which was $1 billion per year, or the development of the electronics and radio electronics industries, and scientific and technological development, as well as other economic and industrial development programs that totaled additional billions of dollars indirectly directed to the war effort. The militarized nature of these programs became so clear that the Russian government chose not to publish detailed information about the execution of these funds anymore. This financial mobilization allowed Russia to greatly expand its military-industrial production. For example, in just a year and a half after the start of the war, about 520,000 new jobs were created in the defense sector. In 2024, Russia allocated about $1 billion just to modernize and expand military-industrial facilities in the Tatarstan region, with special emphasis on the expansion of the Kazan gunpowder factory, financed by Rostec using the company's own resources. The economic efficiency in Russian military production is based on a strategy of prioritizing cheaper and mass-produced weapons as well as modernizing old stockpiles. In 2023, Russia received 2,100 tanks, of which only 210 were new and over 800 were modernized T-72 tanks. Out of the 2,100 tanks delivered to Russian forces, only 210 were new, while more than 800 were just modernized 72 tanks. The rest included old restored vehicles like T-62, T-55, and T-54, mainly used in stationary artillery roles. In the area of precision munitions, Russia adopted a similar strategy, converting large old stockpiles of conventional aerial bombs into guided bombs by installing guidance modules that cost only $20,000 each. This method greatly reduced costs and allowed for a rapid increase in production, going from a few thousand units in 2023 to about 40,000 in 2024, with more than 70,000 planned for 2025. The production of munitions also increased drastically, as I warned in April 2024, and time has shown that I was correct. The connection between Russia and North Korea should not be interpreted as a sign of Russian weakness. In the video explaining how the supply of North Korean munitions to Russia works, I predicted that the purchase of North Korean artillery munitions by the Russians was just a temporary measure to buy enough time for the Russians to increase their own munitions production. And now, a year later, this has proven to be exactly correct. For example, the annual production of 152mm artillery shells grew from 250,000 units in 2022 to about 1.3 million in 2024. The production of 9M723 ballistic missiles increased from 250 units in 2023 to more than 700 in 2024. The daily production of Geran-2 attack drones reached 30 units by the end of 2024. To ensure independence in essential raw materials for the production of explosives and propellants, Russia invested billions in expanding and modernizing facilities in the so-called special chemistry sector, a strategic area for the military effort. Proprietary technologies are being developed to manufacture nitrocellulose from wood and flax, aiming to reduce dependence on cotton, which is mainly imported from China. This intensive level of financial and industrial mobilization is the result of a highly centralized economic policy, with broad financing involving both direct and indirect military funds, extensive use of subsidized credit, robust investment in new production capacities, and a strategy to reduce production costs. However, since money is not an infinite resource, while the Russian state is spending its efforts on the war, it is not spending on other things, especially infrastructure. This raises doubts about how long the Russians will be able to maintain these specific levels of public spending for the military sector without other sectors of society being affected. But then we have the capabilities of the Europeans. In the face of the large-scale invasion of Ukraine, Europe responded with very strong statements of support for Ukraine, reinforcement of NATO, and condemnation of Russia. Germany, for instance, allocated a remarkable $100 billion fund for its military. But despite the almost unanimous financial and political commitment, European defense production remained stagnant for more than a year. The conversion of capital into production capacity was hampered by political dilemmas, regulatory barriers, fragility in supply chains, and uncoordinated internal competition. Initially, European countries prioritized sending portable weapons, such as the NLOL Javelin, Stinger, and other anti-tank and anti-air systems for immediate use. However, their impact was limited, given Ukraine's immense consumption of ammunition. When it became clear that Kyiv would resist beyond expectations, the shortage of artillery ammunition and heavier platforms became critical. European countries with scarce stockpiles and degraded industrial capacity chose to acquire ammunition on the international market, prioritizing quick deliveries that yielded domestic political dividends. The first orders aimed only to replenish the donated stockpiles. However, when negotiations about artillery ammunition began, structural problems then emerged. Most governments were reluctant to make long-term contracts, fearing that demand would not be sustained or that their investments would become economically unviable in the face of competition from other countries within the European Union itself. This led to one-off contracts without enough scale to justify a real expansion of European military industrial capacity. Estonia, alarmed by the inertia, proposed that the European Union deliver 1,155mm shells to Ukraine within 12 months. The European Commission, limited by Article 41 of the Treaty on European Union, could not directly finance activities with military implications. Thus, it tried to solve the problem with framework contracts with the industry, but without guaranteeing the requested volume, which raised the prices to €4,000 per shell, a value considered unacceptable by most analysts. As a result, the European Union only ordered 40,000 shells for 1 year and another 40,000 for the next year. To disguise the failure, the member states began to count their own purchases as part of the common goal, allowing the European Union to declare the supply of 500,000 shells, most of which were acquired on the international market and not produced on the continent itself. Another factor was the energy crisis imposed by Russia, which forced European governments to divert resources to subsidies and liquefied natural gas infrastructure. With economic stagnation and defense not being a priority for the population except on NATO's eastern flank, governments then preferred to redistribute existing funds instead of making new investments, reinforcing the aversion to additional spending. Industry bottlenecks have emerged in production capacity. The manufacturing of shells requires forging, installation of fuses, and filling with explosives. Filling is the biggest bottleneck because it depends on environments with very strict thermal control. After all, it explodes. Since each type of ammunition uses the same infrastructure, different calibers competed with each other for the few available spaces. Expanding this capacity ran into heavy regulations, the need for licenses, and a lack of qualified labor, often resulting in outsourcing to China. The shortage of highly enriched nitrocellulose, essential for propellants, became critical. With few suppliers and strong internal competition, prices then skyrocketed. Before the war, just so you know, a 155mm shell cost between $800 and $3,000. But 2 years after the war, in 2024, the cost ranged between $6,000 and $8,000. Meanwhile, Russia set the price of its 152mm shell at about $1,000. And just for the record, when I say they set the price at $1,000, I'm not saying the Russian government put a cap on it and forced the price to be $1,000. No, they set it at $1,000 because they managed to increase production and make it cheaper as well. The competition among European manufacturers for raw materials drove up costs and reduced total production because an increase for one meant a decrease for another. And furthermore, the expansion of European companies' nitrocellulose production outside of Europe to China created a critical dependency. The lack of machinery, facilities, and specialized labor further compromised the expansion. Private companies, facing low demand predictability and a lack of government incentives, were then reluctant to invest. European production in 2024, together with that of the United States, totaled about 1,500,000 155mm shells delivered to Ukraine when the minimum necessary would be 2.4 million per year. The lesson was clear. The lack of coordination, the protection of national industries, the fragmentation of orders, and the dependence on the free market in a sector that is highly regulated undermined the European responses. Governments were reluctant to take risks or intervene firmly. The result was a slow, inefficient, and frighteningly expensive response. To reverse this situation, it will be necessary to map supply chains, invest with strategic vision, cooperate among allies, and adopt more interventionist and coordinated policies in the defense sector. In the last 3 years, European defense industrial policy has systematically failed not only to scale up the production of basic munitions but also to replenish stocks of precision weaponry. A striking example was the United Kingdom, which since 2022 still has not replaced the handheld anti-tank systems that were donated to Ukraine, even though contracts for this have already been signed. This failure is partly explained by the logic of post-Cold War European production, which was that instead of keeping production lines active, European countries preferred to order small batches of complex weapons and then invest in newer, more modern projects, shutting down previous production. Thus, not only were the production lines shut down, but components and subcomponents also stopped being manufactured, making any attempt to restart production expensive and time-consuming. In the case of the United Kingdom, the new missiles will only be delivered in 2026 after the supply chain has been rebuilt, and that's if it actually happens. Furthermore, the limited shelf life assigned to many munitions for safety reasons discourages large stockpiles, on the grounds that if they are not used, they will become obsolete or even dangerous. However, recent evidence shows that a large part of the Western munitions donated to Ukraine, even past their official expiration dates, still function properly. Russia keeps munitions for decades, using them directly or as a basis for refurbishment. This suggests that a reassessment of the validity criteria could even increase European stockpiles without compromising their safety. Another critical obstacle was the policy of storing vehicles and systems. Again, the United Kingdom, as an example, donated only 14 of its 227 Challenger 1i tanks to Ukraine, since it only plans to modernize 148 units. The limitation came not only from the reduced number of vehicles available, but also from the lack of maintenance kits, whose components were no longer being manufactured. In many European countries, old vehicles were sold to private companies instead of being stored by the state. In Belgium, the fleet of Gepard anti-aircraft guns was sold for 15,000 to 20,000 euros per unit in 2006. In 2023, when trying to reacquire them to then send them to Ukraine, the government faced prices above 500,000 euros per unit, with claims that it was necessary to upgrade radars and electronic systems. Since the contracts were for sale and not for storage, the state lost control over access and deadlines. The production of ammunition also faced legal and political issues related to intellectual property and export control. In the case of the Gepard, the 35mm ammunition was manufactured in Switzerland, which vetoed its shipment to Ukraine due to neutrality issues. It was necessary to develop production in another country, which delayed the delivery. Even when intellectual property rights were available, many manufacturers were reluctant to share them with Kiev, fearing loss of technological control or non-standard use. Drones were another field that was greatly impacted. Although Europe has a powerful aerospace industry, most of the drones used in the war were developed in Ukraine itself. And the main reason was regulatory. Strict airspace and safety regulations made it difficult for European armies to quickly develop and adopt these systems. Since the armed forces weren't losing drones on the same scale as Ukraine, orders ended up being scarce. As a result, the unit cost soared. A drone that costs £2,500 when made for Ukraine can end up costing between £8,000 and £16,000 if produced for use by the British Armed Forces because of regulatory requirements. In another case involving England, a £20 million contract to supply Kiev would generate an estimated cost of £200 million to integrate that same system into the British Army. This discrepancy shows that European investment in military innovation, although it benefits Ukraine, has not translated into parallel modernization of the European armed forces themselves. And this is not due to technological issues, but because of political and regulatory barriers. In other words, it's the European bureaucrats who are bringing down Europe itself. In other words, I'm saying that the European armed forces are not rewarded for maintaining robust stockpiles and don't even have the resources for that. The policy of selling old equipment and the high regulatory costs have contributed to obsolescence and the loss of strategic capability. Bureaucracy has also turned safety rules into disproportionate barriers in the face of combat realities. In other words, the reality that bureaucrats live in is not the same as the reality of the real world of war. 3 years after what Europeans consider to be the greatest threat to European security since 1945 began, the European members of NATO still haven't even managed to adequately supply a single country at war. What will you say to all of them? There are many excuses for the failures, but the main point still stands. The current bureaucratic architecture is not suitable for real life. The challenge that arises is how to ensure that this doesn't happen again. The comparison between the industrial defense responses of Russia and Europe since the large-scale invasion in 2022 shows crucial differences in 4 key areas: preparation, state control, financing, and regulatory environment. First, preparation. Russia had a more well-defined mobilization plan, supported by stockpiles and legal frameworks that allowed it to quickly activate its defense industrial base. Europe, on the other hand, mostly did not have mobilization plans or enough data to quickly develop one. The consequence was a slow, fragmented, and often misguided response. The lesson is clear. All NATO members need to incorporate industrial annexes into their defense plans, properly coordinated with each other, something that currently only the United States does. Second is the degree of state control. Russia and Ukraine maintain a very high level of control over their defense industries, which has allowed them to set goals and redirect capabilities quickly. And for that, it doesn't mean you have to nationalize or disregard private property, and the United States is an example of that. In the United States, the government has legal instruments that subordinate industry to the defense mission, and critical areas such as ammunition end up remaining under the direct management of the Department of Defense. Countries like France, which maintain partial control, have managed to increase production, even if only modestly. Most European countries, however, delegated the effort to market logic, and the market failed to react with the speed and scale required precisely because of the bureaucracy imposed by the state itself. Without long-term orders or consolidated requests, companies couldn't justify investments in expansion. And since governments also control so little of the supply chain, there was a lack of data to allocate resources efficiently. The most notable example was the European attempt to expand ammunition production without securing the supply of explosive chemicals, which resulted in higher prices without a proportional increase in supply. The third issue is about latent capacity and human capital, because Russia and Ukraine already had experienced technical personnel in the defense sector, and since they are integrated with the civilian sector, they can be easily reabsorbed. Russia even converted civilian industries for military use, because before they were civilian industries, they were already military. Europe, despite having a very large pool of talent, was not able to mobilize them. The dispersion of the production chain among a few countries and the lack of investment in sectors like defense chemistry made it difficult to find and retain qualified personnel. Even companies willing to expand their operations faced a shortage of specialized labor, further extending delivery times. And the fourth and last one, the financing models. Russia injected massive resources into its defense industry, including outside the official budget of the Ministry of Defense, putting civilian sectors like health and education in the background. This initial investment in productive infrastructure will allow production to remain high, even with the redistribution of funds starting in 2026. In Europe, the aggregate amounts seem significant, but they are fragmented by country and by project, making them insufficient to generate any proportional impact. The investments were mostly directed toward final products, and not toward the fundamentals of the production chain, which increased costs instead of expanding real capacities. The focus on innovation resulted in sophisticated systems, but they are very scarce. The lack of integration between spending and visible physical results undermined NATO's deterrence credibility, giving Russia the perception that Western responses were inadequate. But the final turning point is the issue of regulation, because in Russia, extremely loose regulations led to safety and efficiency problems, but made expansion easier. And in Europe, excessive regulation created a cycle of inflated costs, delays, and distrust. Restrictions on the use of these systems in test fields resulted in these systems only failing after they were produced, and therefore it was too late. Urban planning laws, environmental bureaucracies, strict labor regulations, and the absence of a coordinating authority compromise ambitious plans, such as the expansion of the United Kingdom's 155mm ammunition production, which still hasn't materialized and probably never will. But perhaps the biggest European failure is structural, the absence of a single authority capable of coordinating its defense industry. Russia and Ukraine operate under centralized command, While in Europe no country is self-sufficient and there is also no effective multinational coordination, meaning they're neither on one side nor the other. The fear of strengthening the European Union's role in this field and NATO's lack of executive powers have created a leadership vacuum because neither the European Union leadership can command too much nor can the national authorities of the individual countries on their own. European companies treat each other as competitors, keeping secrets about their capabilities and making synergies difficult. Fragmentation prevents efficiency and deprives governments of critical information. That's why if Europe ever wants to have a fully autonomous role in relation to the United States, it needs to show that it has the ability to wage war in an absolute sense, and especially to wage war against its own bureaucracy, which now and in the next 3 to 5 years seems unrealistic. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it, and a special thanks to the super members Lucas Silva de Souza and As Portas da Cidade. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know, and consider becoming a member. As a member, not only will you get early access to this kind of video, but you'll also have exclusive access to videos made just for members, as well as live streams that are only for them. You'll also help ensure the Geopolitica Mundial channel can continue focusing on this content. Take care and see you next time. Good evening.